All right, so in today's lecture, we are turning to the topic of environmental justice and animals, or specifically non-human animals. So how does environmental justice apply in the case of these other sorts of beings? So we're going to be looking first at the impacts of animal agriculture. Then we're going to be addressing a philosophical concept called considerability. So this is the question of who counts in our understandings of justice. So who are we concerned about injustices happening to? Then we're going to look at the animal rights movement. So as a social movement advocating for change, what are the issues involved with that movement? And then we're going to wrap up by touching on some cross-cultural perspectives on these animal issues. How much of what we've been saying is specific to sort of modern Western cultures? So to start off, to give you some kind of perspective, so agriculture is by far the largest way in which humans directly interact with animals. And if we look at the total biomass of all living things on Earth, about 59% of the terrestrial vertebrate biomass on Earth is livestock. So that's encompassing all mammals, birds, amphibians, reptiles. Put all of that together, and almost 60% of it is livestock, chickens, cows, pigs, and stuff that are being raised by people. Only about 4% of that total terrestrial vertebrate biomass is actually wild animals, so wild mammals and birds and so forth. And then humans, we ourselves make up the other 37% of the total vertebrate biomass on Earth. So this is a big deal, right? We've got a lot of animals making an enormous impact on the ecosystems of our world. And in fact, about 77% of the arable land, so arable means able to be farmed. So we're setting aside, deserts where stuff isn't going to grow and ice caps and all that kind of stuff. But of the arable land that we could use, about 77% of it is dedicated to livestock. And that encompasses both grazing land, where animals are, eating directly from what's growing there, as well as the production of feed for animals that are kept on a farm, and we grow food, on cropland and bring it to them. So between those two things together, about 77% of the world's arable land. And we can only expect this all to increase because over the last 50 years, meat consumption worldwide has about quadrupled. So we, as a global human population, are eating way more meat than we have in the past. And a lot of that is driven by increased incomes in countries like China that are rapidly developing. So when people are poor, they tend not to eat very much meat. So if we use China as an example, the typical Chinese person 50 years ago ate very little meat. They were functionally vegetarian or close to it, not necessarily out of any sort of ideological reason, opposition to eating meat, but simply for economic reasons, that you couldn't afford to have meat more than occasionally. But as incomes have grown, demand for meat, which is seen as a better, higher quality, higher status food, has grown by quite a lot. And this is something that sometimes we don't realize in the United States, because meat production in the United States is so heavily subsidized by the federal government that it ends up being really cheap on the consumer end. But in most parts of the world where you don't have that subsidy, meat is noticeably more expensive than vegetarian foods. And so that's why as incomes rise, people eat a lot more meat. And like I said, we've seen this global enormous growth in the amount of meat people are eating, and so the amount of meat that we have to produce. And when we're producing this meat, depending on what species we're talking about and the exact way it's being raised and what it's being fed and stuff, it takes somewhere between 2 to 10 times more feed to produce a given amount of meat. So if we take on the lower end of that, chickens tend to be one of the more efficient meat production animals in terms of the amount of feed that they need, but it'll take on average about 2 pounds of chicken feed to produce 1 pound pound of chicken meat that the people can eat. So that means that the expanding meat production means an even greater expansion in the production of the stuff that we're going to feed to these animals. So again, either expansion of pasture lands for the animals to eat their own food, or expansion of croplands to grow feed. And so it's it has this sort of ripple effect in terms of the ecological footprint that that meat involves, and in terms of the number of people that you could support off of that. If that feed is something like corn and soy that people could eat, you can feed fewer people total if you use that as livestock feed and eat the meat than if that were to become human food directly. And meat production is increasingly dominated by what we call concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs, and this is what people are talking about when they use the expression factory farms. So these are operations in which livestock are kept in confined spaces. So they have not a lot of room to move around. You're packing a lot of them into the barns and so forth that they use. Then they're fed mass-produced food, right? So this is not a pasture system. This is a system where then you have farms growing, corn and soy in particular in mass quantities, and then you turn that into animal feed and bring it to the CAFO. And so I'll note in connection with that last point about the ratio of feed to meat, that you'll sometimes hear, for example, about the expansion of soy production in the Amazon. So a lot of deforestation in the Amazon basin right now is being driven by expanded soy farms. That's one of the major products that's being grown on these areas that used to be a tropical rainforest. And when you hear that they're expanding the soy production, your first thought might be like, oh, there's all these people eating tofu that's made from this Amazonian soy. But in fact, most of this soy production is actually going into animal feed. It's being fed to chickens and cows and so forth. It's not going directly into the human food stream. And then the last point that I've got there about CAFOs is that you also see a lot of use of antibiotics on CAFOs. If you've got a huge amount of animals packed in real close to each other, that creates a great environment for diseases to spread. And so you hear from time to time about new, really dangerous strains of the flu that get started, and they're often named after types of livestock. Right? There's bird flu and swine flu and stuff, and there are kind of scares about this every now and then, that those strains are going to start infecting humans and become a pandemic among humans. And these strains of flu are named after types of livestock because they start on these CAFOs in many cases, where you've got a lot of animals together. It's easy for the disease to pass among them. It's easy for the disease to form new mutations and so forth, and then potentially make the jump to humans via the farm workers that are working there. And so in order to control those kinds of things, a lot of times animals are given high doses of antibiotics to prevent them from getting sick and passing on these diseases. So these CAFOs can be a form of LULU. They can be a locally unwanted land use. They're a thing that people don't like to live next to. And so much like all the other types of LULUs that we've been talking about in this course, you often find them located in areas where the surrounding population is predominantly poor and or people of color. So you have a lot of these, for example, in the South in the United States, and so they end up in areas where you have a large rural black population. And so you have the inequalities in who's being exposed to the negative effects of living near these CAFOs, and those include things like pollution from the waste products from the animals. If you've got a giant barn full of cattle, those cattle are going to do a lot of poop, and you have to remove that from the immediate environment of the animals, and you have to do something with it. And often that means putting it into these giant, settling basins where it can be processed into some form that can be disposed of more safely. Well, those can be a source of pollution that can leak into groundwater, that can pollute the air from the bacteria that might be in it, and even just the smell of that is a pollution concern. And then they can also be, as I've said, a source of disease. If diseases get going among the animals on the farm, they can get out into the surrounding human population. Another dimension to animal agriculture is the climate change impacts. And so there's a number of different sorts of climate change impacts that can come, right? If we're going to cut down the Amazon rainforest in order to make cattle pasture or soybean fields to feed cattle on CAFOs, then, that deforestation contributes to climate change. But the kind of best known or kind of highest profile climate change impact from animal agriculture is from methane that's produced by livestock. So livestock flatulence includes methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas, and so it's a significant dimension to the current climate change crisis comes from the methane produced by animal agriculture. And so then once you've got a tie into climate change, you then get a tie into all of the environmental justice issues that arise from climate change in terms of, who is it that's going to be impacted by climate change, right? Who is going to lose their land to sea level rise? Whose livelihood is going to be undermined by changing weather patterns and all of those sorts of things. And then the last thing that I'll note here, let me move my face out of the way, is you also have environmental justice issues arising around labor conditions for the workers at the slaughterhouses. So if you're, producing all these chickens or all these hogs or something, somebody's got to kill them and cut them up and process them into, the chicken wings and pork chops and stuff that somebody's going to buy at the grocery store. And so that happens at slaughterhouses, and a large proportion of the workers at these slaughterhouses are immigrants. And so they're in a very vulnerable position. In many cases, they are undocumented migrants. So they're being kind of exploited by the slaughterhouses because they can get these people to work for cheaper, and if they start to complain about working conditions and stuff, you can threaten to call ICE and get them deported. So they're in this very vulnerable position, and slaughterhouse work is very dangerous work and has very harsh health impacts because the slaughterhouses, in order to make a profit, they're trying to process as many carcasses as they can in as short a time as possible. So you have conveyor belts just whizzing by with chickens or hogs or whatever on it, and then you've got your workers there, usually crowded in kind of shoulder to shoulder with each other with a knife or a cleaver or something, and they'll have there's the one leg that they grab and they cut off, and that's what their job is on that assembly line for many hours in the day after day after day. And so it's very easy to get injured on the job. Right? If you miss slightly with that knife that's extremely sharp in order to cut up this carcass, you or somebody else could get stabbed with it. You could fall into the machinery. And then there's, just the repetitive stress of doing the same cuts on meat day after day after day is not good for your body. And having so many people and animal carcasses all in a confined space close together makes it very easy for disease to spread. And in fact, as we've seen during the COVID-19 pandemic, that slaughterhouses have often been at the center of major outbreaks of COVID. If one person in that slaughterhouse gets it, they pass it to the other people in that slaughterhouse very easily. It's very hard to socially distance and control the spread of something like COVID if it gets into that slaughterhouse worker population, and it's not exactly something you can't work from home as a slaughterhouse worker. So there are these additional justice issues raised about the processing of these animals once they've been raised. Okay. So far we've been looking at animal agriculture, as another Lulu, right? As another thing with negative environmental impacts that people can be unjustly exposed to. But if you remember the picture that I had on the first slide of this, it was from a protest at a CAFO, and I picked that picture because the person in the middle had a sign that said CAFOs are bad for all beings. And so that raises the question of what beings are we concerned about when we talk about environmental justice? Right? Who is it that we're worried about injustices happening to? And so this question has the label in philosophy of considerability. So considerability means what kind of entities does a theory of justice consider? What kind of entities are incorporated into that theory of injustice? Or another way to look at it is who can be a victim of injustice. And so as an illustration of this, if I were to take a pencil from you and break it, that would be an injustice to you, right? You've lost your property that you put some sort of value on. So I've harmed you. I've done an injustice to you. I haven't done any injustice to the pencil. The pencil is not, under most theories of justice, considerable. Right? We don't worry about the pencil for the pencil's sake. We only worry about the pencil because it was your property and you've been harmed if I break your pencil. So I could break my own pencil and there'd be no injustice involved. I own this pencil. I decide what to do with it. If I feel like breaking it to make a point about philosophy, I can do that just as much as I could, use it to write stuff, because the pencil itself cannot be a victim of injustice. Now, of course, if I do a comparable harm to you, to your body, then that would be an injustice to you directly, right? Because you would be considerable under practically any theory of justice that we could reasonably come up with. So considerability is what kinds of entities or beings can be direct victims of injustice, right? Can have that kind of standing that we can do injustices to them, regardless of what effects that might also have on some other entities. So most theories of justice are anthropocentric, and so that means that only humans are considered, right? So anthropos, Greek for human, and so anthropocentric means that it's centered on humans, that humans are what are considered, and in most cases it's all and only humans, right? So all humans are considered, but that's it. That is the range of things. And so harms that we might do to non-human entities matter insofar as some human is harmed by them, right? Just like me breaking your pencil harms you as a person, that's how non-human entities enter into discussions when we're taking an anthropocentric point of view. So we can look at anthropocentrism as a question. Should we be anthropocentric? Should that be the boundary of who is considerable in a theory of justice? And there are arguments that no, we need to expand the circle, that we need to incorporate more beings into our thoughts about considerability. That there are non-human entities that ought to be thought of as potential victims of injustice, even if that doesn't harm any humans. And so what's called the expanding circle argument makes a case for this by seeing this as part of this historic movement towards expanding considerability. So in the past, we had theories of justice that were narrower than anthropocentrism. That said only members of one's own race or one's own gender or one's own tribe or whatever else are considerable. Okay, so there are considerable humans and non-considerable humans. And we have expanded the circle to encompass all humans. All right, we've gone from a theory that only considered your own tribe or nation out to a theory that considers all humans as potential victims of injustice. So why stop there? Why not continue expanding that circle? Why is the boundary of the human species where that process of recognizing more beings as considerable should end? Right? So that's the expanding circle argument, that considering non-human beings is just part of this trajectory that we are already on. A related argument that's often used to back up the expanding circle argument is what's called the marginal cases argument. So the marginal cases argument starts from asking, well, what is it about humans that supposedly makes us so special? If you were anthropocentric, saying all and only humans count, well, what is it about humans that makes us special? Why should humans be the ones that are considerable and non-humans are not? And there's a bunch of different things that people have proposed as to what makes humans special. And the marginal case argument holds that any quality that supposedly makes humans special can be found in some animals, right, some non-humans, and or not found in some humans. So the set of beings encompassed by that quality doesn't match up exactly with the boundaries of the human species, which means you're either going to have to accept that some humans are not in fact considerable and cannot in fact be victims of injustice, or you're going to have to expand at least a little bit and encompass more non-humans. So let me give you an example of how that might work. So one very common quality that people will say makes humans special, makes us different from non-humans, is our ability to use language. Humans clearly have a much greater capacity for language than any other sorts of beings out there. But the boundary of who can use language doesn't exactly match the boundaries of the human species. On the one hand, there are animals that can use language. So there have been a number of cases where apes, especially chimpanzees and gorillas, have been taught to use language. Sometimes it's sign language, sometimes it's by pointing at words on kind of a board with words listed on it. You know, they don't have a voice box, they can't like speak out loud, but they can use other forms of language. And the people that have worked with these apes have pretty well demonstrated that, you know, they're not just sort of imitating language use, they're not just doing a kind of stimulus response kind of thing, but they're genuinely able to comprehend meanings in language and create their own sentences and, you know, express new ideas through the language that they've been taught. You know, so none of these, you know, you're not going to have like a, you know, a Shakespeare gorilla, but they're able to use language in a way that is similar to what some humans can do. And then on the other hand, there are human beings who are not capable of language. People with certain severe developmental disabilities just never manage to comprehend or use language. And so if the use of language is what makes humans special and separates us from the non-humans, then that would seem to mean, if you're going to apply that criterion consistently, that some of these apes that can use sign language and so forth should be considerable, and then certain humans should not. So it doesn't match up with the boundary of the human species. So that's the marginal cases argument. So if we take those two arguments, the expanding circle argument and the marginal cases argument, seriously, then they suggest that we need to go beyond anthropocentrism. And in fact, that anthropocentrism, having a theory of justice that includes all and only humans, is speciesist. So speciesist is a term that was coined in kind of parallel to terms like racist and sexist, and it means unjustly discriminating on the basis of species, right? Treating one species better than another purely because of which species it is would be speciesism. So if we're concerned about speciesism, where do we go, right? What do we get if we expand beyond anthropocentrism? So one option is what we can call sentience centrism. So rather than being centered on anthropos, on humans, we're centered on beings which are sentient. And so sentience means the ability to experience pleasure or pain and to prefer experiencing pleasure and disprefer experiencing pain, right? To want one sort of thing and not another to happen to you. So that's sentience, and there's a lot of debate about exactly what kinds of beings are sentient, what kind of beings can experience pain and dislike it and prefer to have something else happen to them. It, at minimum, encompasses all adult vertebrates. Right? So, if my cat were here, I could, pretty easily demonstrate that he, can feel pleasure and pain and prefers one over the other. Right? So my cat is very clearly sentient. His behavior amply demonstrates that he fits this criterion. And so if we take sentience as our criterion for what kind of beings are considerable, then my cat could be the victim of an injustice. And he certainly thinks that it's a major injustice that he doesn't get fed until 6 o'clock. So that's one option, to go beyond anthropocentrism, to encompass all beings that are sentient. We could then go even further to a position that's called biocentrism. So from bio meaning life. And so biocentrism, we consider all beings which are alive. So everything that is living. So even non-sentient living things. So if we take plants, for example, plants are, at least within a Western cultural framework, we generally don't think of plants as having sentience of a sort that we can recognize, right? Plants aren't going to feel pain. But plants are clearly alive. And so biocentrism says the criterion should be beings that have some sort of a life course, or that engage in goal-directed activity. And we know plants can do that, right? Plants have a life course. Plants grow from a seed through life stages until maturity. And they're goal-directed. Right? They grow their roots down towards where they're going to find water. They grow their leaves up towards where they're going to find light. Right? And you've probably seen examples, right, of plants that are kind of, twisted over to the side because somebody changed where the light was coming from, and they had to redirect their growth to seek out that light. So if there's value to beings being able to pursue that life course, right, if it's good for a being to be able to move towards its goals like that, then you can say, well, then it's an injustice to interfere with that. It's a injustice to harm a living being by depriving it of its ability to follow its life course, and therefore all living beings are considerable. So then you're a biocentrist. And then we can go even further than biocentrism. Right? Biocentrism is focused on individual living organisms. But it doesn't give any consideration to larger entities, things like ecosystems, populations, landscapes, all of these kinds of things. So, if you're looking, for example, at the issue of an endangered species, right? We've got, say, spotted owls, and there's not very many of them left. A biocentrist, or a sentient centrist, since owls are sentient, would be concerned with each individual spotted owl. And they'd be concerned about harm being done to each individual that might, lose its old growth tree that it's going to nest in, or might be killed by a person or something, right? Those would be potential injustices. But the spotted owl species is not something that is directly considerable. There might be instrumental reasons to be worried about a species. It might be good for the stability of the ecosystem, which ultimately helps all of the individual organisms, but the species for its own sake isn't directly considered in either a sentient centrist or biocentrist point of view. Ecocentrism, though, does say something like a species, a larger entity like that, is also considerable. It also matters. It has a existence of its own. It has it obeys natural laws, and therefore it should be taken into consideration. That you can harm a species, and that's bad, in addition to or separate from the harm done to the individual members of the species. So if we, for example, quickly and painlessly sterilized every spotted owl out there, so they just simply lived out their lives and never laid any eggs and had any baby owls, that might pass biocentrist muster, right? Because none of those individual owls are being harmed, but it would destroy the species, and so an ecocentrist would be concerned about that. Now, the catch with ecocentrism, if you've expanded your circle to encompass ecosystems as considerable entities, is that then you're put in the position of having to potentially sacrifice lots of individuals for the good of these larger wholes. So if what's important is what happens to the ecosystem, then in order to promote the good of the ecosystem, you may need to kill a whole bunch of individual beings, including potentially individual humans, might seem to need to be sacrificed for the good of this larger whole. So the broader your circle gets, the more potential conflicts you get between the interests of different entities. You can see that, it starts already, you get to sentient centrism. That creates a conflict between humans' desire to eat meat and sentient animals' desire not to be killed, to be eaten. You get significant conflicts showing up right there, and by the time you get to ecocentrism, you've got lots of potential conflicts that you'd have to adjudicate. You'd have to figure out, does the prima facie injustice of harming one being outweighed by the justice that you'd be doing to another considerable being. So now I want to talk a bit about the animal rights movement. And I'm using the term animal rights here very loosely as kind of a label for this sort of broad movement, because there's a lot of debate about, is rights the correct concept of justice to be using in talking about animals, right? So if we're talking about rights, then we're really taking a libertarian kind of point of view. And not everybody involved in this animal movement is a libertarian, right? There are utilitarians or egalitarians involved in this. So I'm using the term animal rights very loosely to just kind of describe this movement, even though not everybody in this would use a rights-based analysis of justice. So when we look at the animal rights movement, we see that it is predominantly made up of white people. And so this is something that is probably going to remind us of stuff we've said about the mainstream environmental movement. It is also predominantly made up of white people. And a lot of the reasons that the animal rights movement is very white are similar to things that we talked about with the mainstream environmental movement. So I'm not going to rehash all of those things here. You can kind of take the stuff that we talked about last week and apply it to the animal rights movement as well. But there are also some considerations that come up in the animal rights movement that are specific to this movement that aren't necessarily paralleled in the mainstream environmental movement. So one of the considerations is that there's a long history of using comparisons between people of color and animals as a form of racism. That people of color are mistreatment of people of color is justified by comparing them to animals, by suggesting that they are lower on a kind of chain of being than white people are, that they're closer to animals in some way, that they have animalistic kind of characteristics. And so because of that long history of these racist comparisons being drawn between people of color and animals, a lot of racial justice advocacy has centered on establishing a claim to a shared humanity. That we people of color are human just like white people are. We're equally human, therefore we deserve equal rights, equal consideration, and so forth. So a lot of emphasis has been put on shared humanity as a justification for struggles against racism, which then creates complications if you come and say, well, by the way, actually animals should be considered as well, right? Like, I know you've spent your whole life being insulted by being called a dog, but actually dogs should have equal rights to humans as well. That creates difficulties in reconciling some of the claims of these different movements, and the suggestion that animals are equal to humans can sometimes come off like it's dismissing the harms that have been done to people of color by those comparisons and rhetoric. You also have the fact that in the animal rights movement, many activists and organizations try to use analogies of racial violence and oppression to make a statement about animals. So comparing CAFOs, for example, to the Holocaust or to slavery. And so this is often done as sort of an attention-grabbing kind of thing, where you might see a picture of animals suffering in a slaughterhouse next to a picture of people in a concentration camp or something, with the intent to draw an analogy between these and say, well, if you think the Holocaust was bad, you should also think that CAFOs are bad, and and so forth. So this is a thing that often, a piece of rhetoric that often gets used. And this is a problematic piece of rhetoric, and it turns off a lot of people of color from being involved in the animal rights movement. Because the underlying premise of these sort of arguments are that racial justice is a done deal, right? That we have settled that issue, that we have accomplished racial justice, and now we can kind of piggyback our concerns for animals onto these settled questions about racial justice. But in fact, of course, that's not true. We've been seeing all class that racial justice is very much a live issue. And even though, nobody would, or very few people at least, would say to your face, slavery is good and we should bring it back. There's widespread dismissal and downplaying of, how terrible slavery really was. There's refusal to recognize and engage with the ongoing ramifications of slavery, the way that has affected racial equality in the 150 years since emancipation. And so to make these comparisons, to essentially use racial justice ideas as a kind of tool to advance animal rights, seems to ignore the fact that racial justice is still a live issue. It's still something that needs to be fought over and addressed in our society. You also have attacks on marginalized food practices coming from elements of the animal rights movement. And so that means if it's difficult to go after, say, animal killing in general, right? That's a pretty tough thing to advocate for, because that involves massive changes in our society. Movements will try to pick out, well, we're going to, have this more targeted campaign. We're going to go after one type of animal harm or exploitation and try to, get rid of that, and then, keep doing these littler campaigns, and eventually that'll add up to something, right? That's kind of reasonable approach. But the problem is when those littler campaigns seem to single out or target food practices that are done by marginalized people, and therefore have the potential to succeed because, the people that are sort of the hardcore animal rights people that eventually would want to, say, eliminate all hunting and slaughtering of animals can get support from people who are, happy to eat a factory farmed hamburger every day, but have prejudice against these marginalized groups and are happy to see those groups' specific practices as gross and deviant and in need of being banned. And so I've got 3 examples there on the slide of instances where this issue has come up. So we have indigenous hunting practices. So indigenous people in many parts of the world continue to hunt for a significant portion of their subsistence and economic production. And animal rights groups will sometimes target indigenous hunting practices in particular. So one major flashpoint of this has been seal hunting in the Arctic portions of Canada. So indigenous people in that area, the Inuit and some other groups, will hunt seals. They'll kill large numbers of seals and use the meat from the seals, and then also use their skins to make clothing and things. And this is something that animal rights groups have found gets them a lot of sympathy from the broader population that, again, may not have an issue with the way that animals are harmed to support their own lifestyle, but can easily be swayed by the idea of, a cute seal pup getting clubbed by someone. And so then that singles out these indigenous practices for condemnation. An issue that's come up, particularly in Europe lately, is with kosher or halal butchering. So if you are a highly observant Jew or Muslim, then the meat that you eat is supposed to be slaughtered in a very particular way. So there are specific religious standards for how that slaughter has to take place, and those standards are not wholly compatible with some of the animal welfare laws that some countries have put in place. And so that means that you essentially can't do kosher or halal butchering in those countries. And so the concern is that, those minority religious groups are being singled out and their religious practices are being interfered with in the name of animal protection. And it's creating a specific burden on the practice of those religions. And sometimes, then people have to pay a lot of money to get meat shipped in from other countries where that kind of butchering is allowed, and that runs up their prices quite a bit, and makes access harder for people that are trying to be highly observant of those religious rules. And then the third one I've got mentioned there is dog meat in China. In some areas of China, dog meat is eaten. That's just a normal kind of meat that you would eat. But of course, in Western culture, we have a very strict line that we draw between pet animals and livestock animals. And so eating a pig or a cow or a chicken, totally cool. Those are on the livestock side of the line, but dogs go on the pet side of the line. And there are a few animals that can go either way and make people sometimes very uncomfortable. So I have friends that are raising rabbits that they are going to kill for meat, and that sometimes makes people very uncomfortable because are rabbits a livestock animal that you can eat like a pig, or are they a pet animal like a dog or cat that you shouldn't eat? Our culture has this very strict line there. But for people in these areas of China, this isn't throughout all of China, but there's specific areas where dog eating is common, and from their cultural point of view, it's no weirder to eat a dog than to eat a pig. Right? They're both animals that have meat that could be eaten. But because Western cultures have this sort of strong negative feelings about killing dogs, it's again easy for people that are animal rights advocates that ideally would like no animals being slaughtered for meat, regardless of species, to get a bunch of meat eaters who feel strongly about dogs to support them in trying to condemn this one specific food practice there. And then there's also issues within the animal rights movement about cultural appropriation. So, if you've got this predominantly white movement, and you've got people that have decided that, okay, we don't want to kill any animals whatsoever. Right? We don't want to kill any animals for food. We're going to practice a vegan diet. Well, where do you get ideas for what you could eat that's going to give you a well-rounded kind of diet? You don't have a lot of those options within Western white European culture, because those are cultures that have historically had a lot of livestock and had meat and dairy and eggs as a typical part of what people eat. But there are lots of good vegan options coming from other cultures, especially Asian cultures, where it's been very common for people to be vegetarian or nearly so historically. And so there are a lot of complicated questions about cultural appropriation by white vegans of foods coming from other cultures. You'll get, a white vegan chef getting, millions of views on YouTube for presenting a recipe that they ripped off from people in, Thailand or wherever this recipe originates from, and then they may even be presenting it in a way that's sort of inauthentic or culturally insulting or Americanized, but they present it as if it's the real deal or authentic. And so we've got these complicated questions of cultural appropriation that come up when you have this predominantly white movement advocating for a practice that has historically not been common within wider European societies. And then a last note to make about the animal rights movement is that even more so than mainstream environmental movement, there's often this big focus on individual change over systemic issues. And, this is a thing that comes up in mainstream environmentalism as well. Is the right way to talk about climate change to talk about it in terms of, 10 things that you personally can do to save the earth? Or should we be talking about it in terms of how can the federal government regulate these 10 companies that are producing the majority of the CO2 in our atmosphere. Right? You get that sort of individual behavior versus systemic change debate in the mainstream environmental movement, and it tilts really heavily towards the individual change side in large portions of the animal rights movement. So there's a lot of focus on the idea, for example, of go vegan, right? That you as an individual should come to care about animals and therefore change your own personal diet and start eating vegan foods rather than eating animal foods. Right? That you personally should change your shopping and eating habits. Complication with that is that a lot of the way that animals are used and abused in our society is tied into these larger structural and systemic kinds of issues. So not everybody has the access to make those kind of personal changes. Right? If things like poverty, living in a food desert, and those kind of considerations may make it very difficult for certain people. Health issues as well. There are health conditions that make it very difficult to have a complete nutritious diet purely from vegan foods, especially if you also don't have a lot of money to buy specialty products and so forth, or you don't have a lot of time and energy to do a lot of your own cooking. Okay? Sometimes if you change your diet and you need to eat very specialized things, that's a lot of extra work to prepare it for yourself from raw ingredients rather than being able to just buy something you can pop in the microwave that some company has mass produced. So there are barriers to individuals making change, and there are structural things that if they were to be changed, it would potentially create bigger changes than going individual by individual, getting people to alter their eating habits. All right, so something like changing the structure of agriculture subsidies in the United States so that it doesn't favor meat production, that might do more to eliminate CAFOs than trying to convince a whole bunch of individual people to stop eating hamburgers. So you've got these issues of individual change versus systemic change that become very significant in animal rights movement, and so people that see the systemic change as the more important dimension here often don't find a lot of support within a movement that's very focused on individual change. And hang on, speaking of animals, my cat is causing problems down there, but we're almost done here. So the last thing that I just wanted to touch on is a cross-cultural perspective, because a lot of this discussion has been rooted in Western cultural assumptions about what animals are, what our relationship to animals is or should be. Right? If we take something like that expanding circle argument, right? The idea that in the past we had this very narrow circle of considerability that was limited to one's own nation or race or something, that has then expanded to all of humanity, but has not yet expanded farther than that. That's a very Western historical conception that accurately, in very broad terms, describes Western history and philosophy, but that's not necessarily accurate to how other societies have developed over time. So a couple points that I want to highlight here. So first is that meat-heavy diets have often been imposed on people of color through colonialism and capitalism. So many societies have historically had, if not wholly vegan or vegetarian diets that were at least much closer to that than the standard diet of Western cultures. But that Western diet has been imposed on other parts of the world through colonialism and capitalism. There's actually this dietary convergence where the diversity of things that people eat has shrunk over the last few hundred years and become more and more like our standard Western diets. The kinds of things that people eat in the United States have become the kinds of things that people eat throughout the world as a result of colonialism and capitalism. So there are vegan and animal rights activists coming from communities of color that have raised this issue as a reason that people of color and people in non-Western parts of the world ought to support some sort of animal rights position. And so if you want to kind of dig more into this, I've got a suggestion there for you. There's a geographer named Breeze Harper, and she has a blog and then a book called Sista Vegan, where she's talking specifically about Black and African societies and the way that primarily plant-based diets have been supplanted by meat-heavy diets imposed by Europeans, and how that has impacted Black and African communities. And then another example of trying to think outside this Western cultural box is that if we look at the way that animals are viewed by indigenous cultures, we see a clear counterexample to this idea of this expanding circle where our considerability, in the past was very narrow, because indigenous cultures, going back, thousands of years, have often viewed animals as considerable beings, as relatives and or as parallel nations. So you have, the human community, and then you have, the beaver nation as another community that exists alongside the human community. And you've got, the wolf nation and the moose nation and these, other groups with their own sets of beings that are considerable, that we have duties of justice towards. So indigenous cultures, and this is extremely broad generalizations that I'm making here, because this is an hour-long lecture here, but in many indigenous cultures, there was a recognition of non-human entities as considerable, and one of the ways that this challenges a animal rights perspective that comes out of a Western framework is that respect for and justice towards animals need not be incompatible with killing them for food. So indigenous cultures that had this idea of the beaver nation as this separate nation of beings towards which we have duties of justice would also trap and kill beavers for their fur. So taking or harvesting animals is not intrinsically incompatible from this indigenous point of view with having respect and exercising justice towards them. But that doesn't mean, that's not a license for unrestrained exploitation, right? That you can do whatever you want. But it does mean that the sort of underlying premise of the vegan position that you see a lot in Western animal rights advocacy, that says that if you care about animals, if you treat them as considerable, then obviously you can't kill them, because you wouldn't kill another person for meat no matter how hungry you were. So therefore you can't do that to the animal. That equation wouldn't add up from or wouldn't necessarily add up from an indigenous point of view. So I will leave it there, and we'll see you in class to discuss some of this.